The world had ended precisely 17 minutes ago, not with a roar, but with a vacuum. Elias lay pressed into the churned earth of the trench, his ears still ringing with the echo of the final mortar strike, a sound so colossal it felt like his skull had been hit by a tidal wave of air. Now, nothing. Absolute, pristine, crushing silence. It was worse than the barrage itself. The enemy artillery crew, professionals in psychological warfare, had fired 1,000 shells in 20 minutes, tearing the tree line opposite to shreds, churning the mud into a bloody slurry, and then, without warning, they ceased. The silence was not peaceful. It was a physical weight, like wet concrete settling over the world. Elias swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of fear and dust. He tried to count his heartbeats, but the pulse drumming in his temporal artery drowned out everything else. His immediate surroundings offered no comfort. The rain that had started 5 minutes into the quiet was gentle, almost mocking, tapping softly on his helmet. Yet even that small, natural sound seemed alien, disrespectful of the void the war machine had created. He swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of fear and dust. He tried to count his heartbeats, but the pulse drumming in his temporal artery drowned out everything else. His immediate surroundings offered no comfort. The rain that had started 5 minutes into the quiet was gentle, almost mocking, tapping softly on his helmet. Yet even that small, natural sound seemed alien, disrespectful of the void the war machine had created. He closed his eyes, focusing purely on what he could not hear, straining his temporal lobes until they ached. Was that the gentle scraping of boot leather on rock? Or was it merely the static distortion left behind by the shell shock? The uncertainty was the intended poison. This was the moment the other side excelled in, the quiet, meticulous advance, using the absence of sound as a cloak thicker than any fog. If he fired now, he would be giving away his position to an unknown number of ghosts. If he waited, those ghosts might already be standing over him, their faces hidden by the dripping shadows of the tree line that had suddenly grown unnaturally dark in the unnatural quiet. He felt profoundly alone, isolated not by distance, but by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the silence that encompassed this tiny, ruined patch of land.
The silence was porous, leaking into the edges of Elias's memory. He remembered the last sound that truly mattered, the one swallowed whole by the subsequent void. It was Corporal Hemlock's voice, sharp and high, screaming a warning about the short fall of the third round, followed by a sound Elias could only describe as wet breakage. He couldn't verify Hemlock's status now, not without disrupting the manufactured tranquility that was now the defining feature of the battlefield. The weight of that potential loss, left hanging in the air due to tactical necessity, pressed down on him more heavily than the pack on his shoulders. He shifted his focus to the purely physical environment, trying to anchor himself in objective reality. The cold was pervasive, a deep, penetrating chill rising from the muddy earth, leaching warmth from his fatigues and settling deep in his bones. The constant rain was now a miserable drizzle, but it performed the critical function of softening the ground, dampening any minor movement the enemy might attempt, making their approach even more spectral. This environment, usually chaotic and loud, had become a perfect, silent hunting ground. He ran a gloved hand across the surface of the mud, feeling the grit and the strange, oily residue left by the explosives. It smelled metallic, like copper and freshly turned soil. Elias realized that the silence was forcing him into hyper-awareness of his other senses. He could practically taste the humidity, could see the slight shimmer of heat rising from the recent impact craters, and every distant scent, pine needles, wet wool, and the faint, unmistakable aroma of fear, was amplified tenfold. He focused on the memory of sound, trying to recall the cadence of a normal world. Back home in the flatlands, there was always noise. The distant rumble of a freight train crossing the valley, the insistent whine of the old refrigerator motor, the perpetual chirping of crickets under the summer moon. Even when he tried to seek silence then, it was always a relative term, full of the white noise of civilization. This silence here, however, was absolute, sterile, and intentional. It was designed to break the mind, to replace auditory cues with internal panic. He thought about the men facing him across the blasted field. They were listening too, straining to hear the smallest mistake, the cough, the gear shift, the desperate whisper into a radio mic. They knew the fear the silence engendered because they were enduring it too, but they had initiated it, giving them the psychological advantage of control. He wondered if they were feeling the same crushing cold, or if they were huddled in deeper, drier positions, enjoying the spectacle of American nerves fraying under the pressure of nothing happening. The irony was suffocating. War was supposed to be loud, destructive, cathartic. Instead, it had become this agonizing test of endurance against the sheer absence of sound, a bizarre, silent opera where the only performer was his own escalating dread. The radio, his one tether to sanity and safety, lay inert beside him, encased in its olive-drab casing. Elias reached out slowly, ensuring the friction of his glove against the plastic casing made no audible sound in the dreadful stillness. He pressed the transmit button, the click of the contact switch feeling like a gunshot in the vacuum of the trench. He held his breath, waiting for the hiss of static to confirm the connection. The static, when it came, was a glorious, grating symphony. It was noise, predictable noise, noise that proved the airwaves were still alive, that the world had not completely ceased to function around his small, isolated pocket of fear. He lowered his lips close to the receiver, whispering his call sign. The whispered words felt enormous, booming, yet they were swallowed instantly by the relentless drizzle and the wide-open expanse of the silent front. Waiting for a reply was another exquisite form of torture. The pause stretched, elastic, and infinite. Command was miles away, operating in their own sphere of controlled communication and perceived security. They wouldn't understand the psychological weight of this quiet. They would hear his weak signal, register the coordinates, and assume routine procedure. They couldn't hear the silence that was crushing him. He imagined the operator at the other end, bored, sipping cold coffee, completely oblivious to the fact that Elias was fighting the most profound battle of his life against auditory deprivation. Finally, a response came back, garbled, faint, but recognizable. Soliger 6, repeat position, situation report. The voice sounded impossibly far away, distorted by the weather and the terrain. Elias forced himself to maintain the whispering tone, relaying the key details. Barrage ended. 0 movement detected since 2300 hours. Confirming absolute quiet. Requesting instructions. We are listening. He deliberately emphasized the last phrase, hoping the operator would catch the undercurrent of panic disguised as tactical awareness. The silence returned as the operator consulted maps, or perhaps simply considered the oddity of a soldier reporting absolute quiet as the primary threat. During this agonizing silence, Elias's mind began to invent things. He heard the faint, metallic scrape of something heavy being dragged through the pine needles just beyond the wire. A sound too rhythmic, too intentional to be natural. He strained, certain that the enemy was positioning heavy equipment, perhaps a mounted machine gun, knowing that the smallest preparatory noise would be swallowed by the rain and the intervening distance. He lifted his head slightly, peering over the muddy lip of the trench. Nothing. The tree line was a black, impenetrable wall. He lowered his head, chastising himself. Hallucination, auditory fatigue, the mind, starved of real input, manufacturing threats. But what if it wasn't? What if they were banking on him dismissing the scrape as paranoia? The static crackled again, loud and sharp. The operator advised holding position, maintaining silence, and reporting any change in status. Change in status. Elias felt a bitter, hysterical laugh bubble up in his throat. The status was the silence itself, and that was the change that mattered. They had not been hit by artillery. They had been hit by a strategic, perfect vacuum, and command had no protocol for fighting nothing. The memory of the ticking clock was the sharpest sound Elias could summon from the past. It was the large, brass-cased pendulum clock in his grandmother's hallway, and its ticking had been the background rhythm of his childhood summers. Loud, regular, reliable. Tick-tock. A perfect metronome against the slow, predictable current of life. That sound was order. This silence was chaos. He remembered sitting under that clock, meticulously cleaning his father's hunting rifle, the clatter of the disassembled parts on the wooden table seeming immense then. Now, checking the bolt action of his own service rifle, the small mechanical clicks as he confirmed the seating of the round felt like explosions. He moved with agonizing slowness, lubricating the action with a thin film of oil he kept in a small tin, ensuring that if he needed to fire, the mechanism would move with fluid grace, producing the least possible resistance and therefore the least possible noise. The oil smelled like civilization, clean, manufactured, purposeful. He rubbed his thumb over the barrel, feeling the minute imperfections in the cold steel, grounding himself in the tangible object that was his only friend. He allowed himself a few seconds to fully indulge in the sensory memory of home. Not the specific sight of his family, which was too painful, but the sounds. The heavy clang of the cast-iron skillet on the stove as his mother cooked breakfast. The relentless, high-pitched buzz of cicadas in the August heat. The wet slap of waves on the dock where he used to fish. These were all sounds of life continuing, of normalcy and safety. This enforced quiet, however, screamed of unnatural cessation, of a pause button hit by a malevolent force. The contrast between the memory and the current reality was tearing at the thin membrane of his sanity. He briefly entertained the thought of simply walking away, not running, but just standing up, walking out of the trench, and trekking until he heard something human again. A farmer's dog barking, the screech of a distant car horn, the cheerful, ignorant babble of a civilian radio show. The desire for ambient noise, for the meaningless clutter of life was nearly overwhelming. He reasoned that death by enemy fire would be loud and fast, but death by this silence would be a slow, internal collapse. He had to remind himself that desertion would only exchange one form of silence, the tactical vacuum, for another, the permanent, historical silence of disgrace and execution. He settled back into the mud, pulling his helmet lower against the drizzle, trying to transform himself from a nervous soldier into a patient, unmoving fixture of the landscape. He decided to dedicate the next hour purely to focusing on the sounds of nature, hoping to filter out the manufactured silence of war. The rain, the slow drip from the saturated canvas covering the trench lip, the faint, whispering movement of the wind through the pines. But even nature's sounds felt subservient to the overarching quiet, too delicate to provide real comfort, too easily overridden by the phantom sound of a boot hitting a root. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the incremental cooling of the air and the increasing tension in Elias's shoulders. The absolute stillness had shifted from a momentary tactical maneuver to a profound psychological strategy. It wasn't just a pause, it was a siege waged purely against the mind. Elias felt his grip tighten around the rifle, knuckles white, driven by the certainty that this silence was deliberate, planned, and ruthlessly executed. The enemy understood that the human brain evolved to interpret sound as a key marker of proximity and threat. By removing all input, they forced the mind to implode, filling the void with its own worst nightmares. Then, in the midst of his intense focus on the nothingness, Elias saw it. It was small, insignificant, and yet it felt like a seismic event. Nestled just outside the lip of the trench, partially obscured by a clump of sod, was a fresh cigarette butt. It hadn't been there when the barrage started. It was white, pristine filter material, barely damp, showing the faint yellow stain of recent use. It was undisturbed by the subsequent rainfall. That meant someone had been standing there, smoking, after the silence began. They weren't just across the field, patiently waiting. They were close, monitoring him, perhaps standing over him while he was whispering into the radio. The implication was staggering. The enemy had been within touching distance, and the only reason Elias hadn't known was the perfect, terrifying silence they maintained. They were ghosts, utilizing the quiet as a perfect invisibility cloak. This wasn't about holding the line. It was about being observed, quantified, and terrorized. The silence wasn't a tactical retreat. It was an intimate invasion. Elias's stomach coiled into a knot of cold dread. He was being hunted, and his only warning was the deliberate lack of warning. The psychological warfare had reached its zenith. They were playing with him, allowing the silence to ferment his paranoia before delivering the final silent stroke. They were betting that the sound of nothing would render him incapable of reacting when the real movement finally came. This discovery forced Elias to confront the moral abyss of the situation. Is the paralyzing uncertainty of the quiet, the fear of the unseen enemy operating in perfect stealth, truly worse than the visceral, immediate fear of an artillery barrage, where at least the threat is known, loud, and quantifiable? It makes you wonder what deeper, more insidious damage is done when war takes away even the comforting structure of sound. I want to ask you, watching this, reading this story, which is the true terror of war? The overwhelming certainty of visible destruction, or the crippling, soundless uncertainty of being hunted by ghosts? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The cigarette butt, still resting innocently in the mud, was screaming its presence, a silent witness to his failed vigilance. He knew he had to react, but the move he needed to make, a simple, swift turn to check his flank, felt impossibly loud. The silence demanded absolute immobility. Elias decided that immobility was the only defense left. The discovery of the cigarette butt cemented the fact that the perimeter had been breached, but not by force, by stealth and psychological pressure. He adopted the demeanor of a statue, forcing his body into a rigidity that soon became painful. Every muscle fiber protested, demanding movement, warmth, or release. He focused on maintaining a breathing pattern so shallow and slow it barely disturbed the moisture on his lips. This enforced stillness, designed to counter the enemy's silent advance, only amplified the internal chaos. The moon, now fully emerged from behind the thinning clouds, cast a stark, monochromatic sheen over the devastated landscape. The mud glistened like black oil, and the skeletal remains of the pine trees stood silhouetted against the pale sky. The fog, cold and dense, began to creep across the ground, licking at the barbed wire line 40 meters ahead. The fog was a double-edged sword. It obscured his view, but it also offered the enemy a perfect, sound-dampening cover for their final approach. Elias remembered a lesson drilled into them during training. Noise attracts, but silence hunts. He now understood that axiom with a terrifying, visceral clarity. He thought of the enemy, perhaps now prone in the crawling fog, relying purely on the sensation of wet earth and the slow, agonizing calculation of distance. They weren't fighting artillery shells or machine guns. They were fighting the clock, waiting for the exact moment the soldier opposite them broke. He realized the battle had become purely temporal, a test of who could endure the silence longer. The physical pain of his position became a bizarre form of concentration. The ache in his knees, the tremor in his hands, the dryness in his throat, all served as distractions from the true, deeper terror, the quiet. He tried counting backward from 1,000, a simple mental exercise to prevent the mind from inventing sounds, but he kept losing his place, pulled back into the dreadful reality by the imagined click of a safety being released, or the barely perceptible drag of fabric on mud. He thought of the helmet Hemlock had worn, the specific dent on the side from a training accident months ago, and wondered where Hemlock was now, and if his body was part of the ongoing silence. The pressure of the silence was so intense that he almost wished for the return of the bombardment, for the cleansing noise of destruction, just to break the spell. but the night remained perfectly, terrifyingly quiet, broken only by the incessant, small, natural sounds that now seemed to collude with the enemy. The drip, the whisper of the wind, the soft, squishy complaint of the waterlogged earth.
He watched the wire. The barbed wire, strung loosely between splintered posts, was the demarcation line between his sanity and the abyss. 40 meters of steel thorns, normally a noisy deterrent, now stood silent and foreboding. He stared until his vision blurred, converting the wire into a vibrating line of light against the darkness. It was a visual tremor, not an auditory one, that finally snapped him from his trance. The movement was minute, barely discernible against the creeping fog. A single strand of the wire, near the central post, shifted downward, held for a moment, and then rebounded slightly. It wasn't the wind. The movement was too deliberate, too heavy. Someone was manipulating the wire, cutting it, or maybe pressing it down slowly to slip underneath. Elias's training kicked in, overriding the panic. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't raise his rifle. He forced himself to identify the exact point of the movement and track it through the deepening fog. He remembered the legendary whispers among the veterans, stories of the enemy's silent patrols, men who moved like water, communicating only through intricate hand signals, using specialized tools that cut the wire without making the metallic snip that sound normally produced. They were trained, allegedly, to take out entire command posts by knife, leaving only the aftermath of silent carnage. That was the fear this absolute quiet manufactured, the fear of being overrun without ever hearing the approach. He raised his rifle slowly, not pulling it to his shoulder, but just lifting the barrel a few centimeters off the mud, aiming toward the area of the wire movement. He kept his finger off the trigger, waiting for the absolute confirmation. The glimpse of a shape, the shadow of a helmet, a sliver of cloth. He held the position, locked in a silent duel with the unseen entity. His heart hammered against his ribs, but the sound was trapped beneath layers of wool and canvas. He focused on the tiny rhythmic drip of water from the trench ceiling, trying to use it as a countermeasure, a mental metronome to slow down his perception of time. Every second felt like a geological epic. The movement ceased. The wire remained motionless, stretching taut and sharp across the gloom. Had they seen him? Had they sensed his vigilance? Or had the patrol simply passed that point, now moving laterally, out of his narrow field of view, toward his vulnerable flank? The silence, which had allowed them to approach undetected, was now preventing him from confirming their position. He needed a sound, any sound, the breaking of a twig, the soft thump of a dropped piece of equipment to tell him where to shoot. But the fog and the relentless quiet denied him that crucial information. He was trapped, aiming a lethal weapon at an invisible threat, his only action being continued, painful waiting. The power of the silence was total. It had turned his deadly weapon into a useless piece of cold iron, because without sound, there could be no certainty of target.
Elias could not wait any longer. The oppressive weight of the silence, coupled with the knowledge of the enemy's proximity, demanded action, however risky. If he stayed put, he would be enveloped. He had to know the fate of Hemlock, and he needed to retrieve something that could definitively confirm the enemy's intentions, not just a discarded cigarette butt. Moving slowly, using the thickest, blackest shadows of the trench wall as cover, he crawled toward the spot where Hemlock had been positioned. The mud sucked at his knees, each tiny squelch sounding monstrously loud to his strained ears. The rain had briefly stopped, and the air was now thick, heavy, and silent. Reaching Hemlock's position, he found the earth completely pulverized, the result of the short-falling mortar. There was no sign of the corporal, only a dark, disturbed depression in the mud. Then he saw it. Perfectly centered on a tree stump that had survived the blast, arranged with a deliberate, mocking precision, was Hemlock's helmet. It wasn't flung there by the explosion, it was placed. It was facing the trench, facing Elias. It looked less like battlefield debris and more like a macabre scarecrow, a message written in the language of terror. The helmet's placement was the final, devastating realization of the enemy's objective. They weren't just observing him, they were psychologically dismantling him, using the silence as their canvas. They had taken Hemlock, or perhaps simply disposed of his body, retrieved his helmet, and used it as a taunt, all without making a sound audible to Elias. The audacity, the calculated cruelty of the gesture was amplified 1,000 times by the encompassing quiet. In a loud battle, this would have been lost, trivialized by the overwhelming noise. In the silence, it was a thunderbolt. The helmet became a focal point for all the fear the night had engendered. The lost innocence, the vulnerability, the realization that he was facing not just soldiers, but masters of the psychological edge. Elias reached out a shaking hand, intending to retrieve the helmet, but hesitated. What if it was rigged? What if the act of touching it was the final trigger? The silence made him question everything, trust nothing. He pulled back his hand, his teeth clenched against a rising tide of nausea. He realized that the helmet was the sound he had been waiting for, a scream disguised as an object. The message was clear. We were here, we took your friend, and you heard nothing. You are alone, and you are next. The fact that the enemy had been able to execute such a complex, calculated operation under his very nose, relying entirely on the silence, broke something fundamental in Elias's resolve. The absence of sound had transformed from a tactical nuisance into a permanent internal scar.
The night finally surrendered to a faint, bruised gray in the east. Dawn did not bring sound, only a shift in the quality of the light. The silence remained, but it was now a silence of exhaustion rather than strategic tension. Elias, stiff and cold, watched the morning light filter slowly through the fog, illuminating the destruction in stark, unforgiving detail. He had survived the watch, but he had not won the battle. The silence had won. The morning revealed the full extent of the enemy's presence, not through bodies or equipment, but through absence. There were faint, clear boot prints in the mud near where the cigarette butt had been, leading off into the dense pine forest. They were deliberate, deep impressions, suggesting the methodical retreat of trained men. They had vanished without a trace, taking whatever they had intended to take, having achieved their primary objective, breaking the spirit of the few soldiers left guarding this sector. The enemy had used the night not for a major assault, but for specialized reconnaissance and psychological operations, retreating before the light could force them into an actual firefight. Elias finally stood, his legs protesting the sudden movement. He looked across the devastated landscape, the shell craters now filling with the greasy rainwater. The world was beginning to stir, but weakly. A distant bird called, a thin, tentative chirp that was immediately swallowed by the vast, open space of the silent front. The radio crackled back to life, the static now seeming less menacing and more irritating, confirming that the new day brought new routines. He forced himself to move toward Hemlock's helmet on the stump. This time, he grabbed it swiftly. It was cold, heavy, and contained only mud and a residual scent of sweat. No explosives, no wires, just the tangible proof of the night's trauma. He clipped it to his belt, a heavy souvenir of a battle fought and lost purely in the realm of psychology. He knew that the visible wounds of this war would eventually heal, the shrapnel removed, the cuts stitched. But the wounds inflicted by the silence, the deep fissures of paranoia and auditory hallucination, were permanent. They had convinced him that the threat was always there, just beyond the range of his hearing, waiting for his first mistake. This realization was the true victory for the enemy. They had taken the one thing a soldier relies upon for certainty, sound,
and weaponized its absence, ensuring that every subsequent moment of quiet, even years later, would carry the weight of a poised knife.
When the relief squad finally arrived, crunching through the pine needles 20 minutes later, their footsteps sounding like an invading army after the hours of absolute stillness, Elias felt only profound detachment. He noted the absurdity of their noise, the chatter, the clatter of gear, the sound of one man clearing his throat. They were loud, careless, living in a world of casual sound that Elias no longer inhabited. He tried to explain the night, the perfect vacuum, the cigarette butt, the silent removal of hemlock, the placement of the helmet. But his words sounded flat, disjointed, like the ravings of a man who had spent too long alone. The relief sergeant, a man with tired eyes and a perpetually shaking hand, nodded dismissively. "Standard psych ops, son. They hit the artillery, then they go quiet. Try to make you jumpy. Oldest trick in the book." But the sergeant hadn't been in the silence. He hadn't felt the absence of noise press in on him like the walls of a collapsing building. Elias knew the sergeant was wrong. This wasn't an old trick. This was an evolutionary leap in cruelty, perfectly calibrated to shatter the modern nervous system. Elias was formally relieved, instructed to report to the field hospital for a psychological evaluation and a hot meal. He gathered his weapon, his muddy gear, and the heavy, accusing helmet. As he walked away from the trench, the noise of the incoming squad seemed to dissipate quickly behind him. He found himself walking carefully, placing his feet with unnatural precision, worried about the sound of his own boots. He was now incapable of distinguishing between necessary ambient noise and tactical sound. The world had become too loud, and yet, simultaneously, the core of his being was filled with an echoing silence. The silence of the pine forest, the silence that followed the screaming. He carried the sound of nothing with him, a permanent companion. It was heavier than his rifle, colder than the mud, and more corrosive than any acid. He realized that they had successfully taught him that silence was not merely the absence of sound, it was the presence of ultimate, unseen danger. He looked back once at the trench line, now occupied by the loud, careless men who had not yet been introduced to the terror of the void, and felt a deep, terrible pity for their ignorance. He was walking away from the physical battlefield, but the quiet, deadly battle continued inside his head, a relentless, silent siege that would likely last the rest of his life. He finally understood why silence was the deadliest weapon, because it leaves no shell casings, no bodies, and no observable wounds, but it fundamentally destroys the soldier from the inside out, making them forever suspicious of peace. The silence was perfect, and perfection is terrifying. If this story, focusing on the unseen wounds of psychological warfare and the enduring terror of the void, touched your heart and made you look at the hidden costs of conflict differently, please consider subscribing to Quiet Soldiers Stories. We strive to bring you tales of resilience, loss, and the introspective moments often overlooked in the grand narratives of history. Thank you for listening.